There are cases that close, and then there are cases that follow you, cases that live in the back of your mind, long after the news cycle moves on, long after the search parties disband, long after the flyers fade in the rain. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance is one of those cases. She was a wife, a mother, a woman who, by every account, showed up for the people she loved without fail. She had a routine. She had roots. She had no reason to simply vanish. And yet, one ordinary morning, Nancy Guthrie was gone. No dramatic goodbye. No warning signs that anyone could point to with certainty. Just absence. A silence that filled her home and never left for years. The questions surrounding her disappearance circled without landing. Investigators searched. Her family pleaded. The community held vigils. And still, the truth stayed hidden, buried beneath grief, rumor, and unanswered phone calls. But something has changed. Her daughter, Annie Guthrie, has finally spoken. After years of silence, after years of carrying something unbearable alone, Annie sat down and told the story the way she lived it, from the inside. And what she revealed doesn't just add a new chapter to this case, it reframes everything. Stay with us, because this story is not what you think it is. And by the end of this documentary, you'll understand exactly why Annie waited so long to say what she now can no longer keep silent. To understand what happened to Nancy Guthrie, you first have to understand who Nancy Guthrie actually was. Not the name on the missing persons report, not the photograph circulated in news articles. The real woman, the one her family knew at 6 in the morning, before the world asked anything of her. Nancy grew up in a small town where everyone knew your last name before they knew your face. She was the kind of child who remembered birthdays without being reminded, who brought soup to neighbors she barely knew, who treated kindness not as a virtue to perform, but simply as a way of moving through the world. She married young. Most people who knew her said the same thing about her marriage. It was complicated, in the way that long, real relationships always are. There were good years and hard years, seasons of warmth and seasons of distance. But Nancy stayed. She wasn't the type to walk away from something she had built. Her children, and Annie in particular, were the center of her world. People who visited their home described it as lived in the best possible sense. Books stacked on every table. A kitchen that always smelled like something was almost ready. Laughter that started and stopped and started again. Nancy worked. She was practical, grounded, never one for drama or spectacle. She didn't post much on social media. She didn't seek attention. What she sought, day after day, was simply to do her part, in her home, in her community, in the quiet places where most of life actually happens. So, when she disappeared, the people who knew her were not just frightened. They were confused in a way that went deeper than fear, because Nancy Guthrie was not a woman who disappeared. She was a woman who showed up, every time. Without fail, the last confirmed sighting of Nancy came on a Tuesday morning. A neighbor saw her pulling out of her driveway. She waved, the same small, unhurried wave she always gave. Nothing in her expression suggested urgency. Nothing suggested goodbye. And then she was gone. Her car was found 3 days later, parked on a side road outside of town. The engine was off. Her purse was inside. Her phone, locked and low on battery, sat wedged between the center console and the passenger seat. No Nancy. The investigation that followed was thorough by most standards. Police canvassed the area. Family members gave statements. Tips came in from across the region. But the leads, one by one, dried up. The case went cold in the way that cold cases do, not with a dramatic door slamming shut, but with a slow, aching quiet. And Annie Guthrie, Nancy's youngest daughter, watched all of it from the closest possible distance. She watched investigators work. She watched rumors spread. She watched the people around her grieve and speculate and eventually, painfully, move on. But Annie never moved on, because Annie knew something. Something she wasn't sure anyone would believe. Something she had been carrying for years, waiting for the right moment, or maybe just for enough courage. That moment has now arrived. The weeks immediately following Nancy's disappearance were, by Annie's own description, a kind of waking nightmare. Everything felt simultaneous, to slow and to fast at once. The house was never quiet. filled with relatives and investigators and well-meaning neighbors. And yet the absence, at the center of all that noise, was absolutely deafening. Annie was in her mid-20s when her mother vanished, old enough to navigate the logistics of a crisis, young enough to be completely shattered by one. She remembers sitting at her mother's kitchen table while detectives asked her questions. She didn't know how to answer. She remembers nodding, responding, appearing composed, while somewhere underneath, she was completely untethered. The early investigation focused heavily on geography. Where had Nancy gone after pulling out of that driveway? Were there cameras along her likely routes? Had anyone at a gas station, a diner, a pharmacy, had anyone seen her? The search was methodical. It was professional. And it produced almost nothing. What it did produce were questions about Nancy's personal life. Her marriage had gone through a rough patch in the year before she disappeared. There had been arguments, nothing anyone could point to as extraordinary, but enough to color the story the media began constructing around her absence. Annie hated that narrative. She hated the way it reduced her mother to a supporting character in someone else's story. Nancy was not a woman defined by her struggles. She was defined by how she faced them, and Annie held onto that distinction like a lifeline. But even Annie, who knew her mother better than almost anyone, had noticed something in the final weeks before the disappearance. Something small, something she had almost dismissed. Her mother had seemed distracted. Not anxious, not frightened, just distant. In a way that was deeply unusual for a woman so consistently present. She would start sentences and not finish them. She would stare at her phone and put it down without responding to whatever she had seen. Once, when Annie asked if everything was all right, Nancy had smiled and said yes, in a way that landed somewhere between reassurance and deflection. Annie thought nothing of it at the time. She thinks about it constantly now. There was one moment, one specific, quiet moment, that Annie has returned to more times than she can count. It was about 10 days before Nancy disappeared. The two of them were sitting on the back porch of Nancy's house, on the kind of late summer evening where the air finally softens, and everything feels a little more possible. Nancy had been talking about her garden. She had always loved that garden, not in the precious, curated way of someone performing a hobby, but in the real, soil under fingernails way of someone who genuinely needed to watch things grow. She talked about what she wanted to plant in the fall. She made plans, detailed plans. And then she stopped, mid-sentence, and looked at Annie with an expression that Annie has never been able to fully describe. It wasn't sadness exactly. It wasn't fear. It was something closer to the look of a person who has just understood something important and hasn't yet decided what to do with the understanding. "You know I love you," Nancy said. Just that. Simple, direct, slightly out of nowhere. Annie said of course she knew. They hugged. The evening continued. The moment passed the way moments do when you're living inside them rather than looking back at them. But Annie has looked back at that moment hundreds of times since. And what she sees now, with the clarity that only loss and time can provide, is a woman who was trying to say something she hadn't yet found the words for. What was Nancy trying to say? That question drove Annie through 2 years of silence, through sleepless nights and conversations she rehearsed but never had, through a grief complicated by the fact that it had no clear ending to attach itself to. And then Annie started finding things. It started with a box. Nancy had been the kind of person who kept things, not in a hoarding, chaotic way, but in the deliberate way of someone who understood that paper holds memory, letters, cards, receipts that meant something, photographs tucked into envelopes, labeled in her careful, compact handwriting. Annie had been going through her mother's belongings slowly, the way you do when the task feels both necessary and unbearable. Most of what she found was familiar, the artifacts of a life she already knew. But near the bottom of a box she discovered in the back of Nancy's closet, she found something she did not recognize. It was a series of handwritten notes. Not a journal exactly, more like fragments, observations, thoughts that Nancy had apparently felt the need to write down and keep, though not in any place where they were meant to be easily found. Nancy's disappearance and ending about 3 weeks before the last confirmed sighting. Annie read them sitting on her mother's bedroom floor. She read them slowly, then quickly, then slowly again. And by the time she finished, The shape of her mother's final year looked entirely different from everything. She had understood it to be. Nancy had been scared. Not of her husband, not of a stranger, not of anything that had yet appeared in any investigative report. She had been scared of a situation, a complicated, layered situation that involved people Annie recognized, and people she didn't, a web of circumstances that Nancy had apparently been trying to navigate entirely alone. The notes didn't explain everything. They weren't meant to, but they pointed in a direction, and for the first time since her mother vanished, Annie felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly, but something equally powerful, purpose. Annie didn't go to the police immediately. That decision, the hesitation, the waiting, is something she has been open and honest about. She was afraid of being dismissed. She was afraid that a box of handwritten fragments from a missing woman would be filed away as circumstantial, emotional, the understandable grasping of a grieving daughter. She was also afraid of what pursuing the truth might cost, because the notes, fragmented as they were, implied something deeply uncomfortable. They implied that Nancy had not simply stumbled into danger. She had been moving toward something, or deliberately away from something, with a quiet intention that suggested she understood the stakes far better than anyone around her had ever realized. Annie spent months doing her own research. She reached out carefully to people mentioned in the notes. Some didn't respond. Some responded in ways that confirmed exactly what she feared, that there were people who had known far more about Nancy's state of mind in her final months than they had ever shared with investigators. The picture that emerged was not of a woman in crisis. It was of a woman in motion, a woman who had discovered something, or decided something, and had begun, methodically and without telling anyone, to act on it. What had Nancy discovered? What had she decided? Annie is careful about how much she shares publicly. She has reasons for that carefulness, legal reasons, personal reasons, and a profound respect for her mother's privacy, even now, even in absence. But she will say this: her mother did not simply disappear. Nancy Guthrie, she believes, made a choice. And understanding that choice, understanding why Nancy felt she had to make it entirely alone, is the thing that drives Annie forward, even on the days when forward feels impossible. The community around Nancy's disappearance never fully went quiet. Small towns rarely do. Stories circulated, some sympathetic, some not, some wildly disconnected from anything resembling fact. Annie heard all of them. She absorbed them the way family members of missing persons absorb everything, cataloging, weighing, dismissing, occasionally pausing on something that snagged like a loose thread. One story in particular kept coming back to her. It involved a woman, a former acquaintance of Nancy's, who had reached out to Annie once, early in the investigation, then retreated before any real conversation could happen. Annie had tried to follow up and been met with silence. At the time, she assumed it was simply the way grief made people retreat. But after reading her mother's notes, Annie saw that name again. And this time, she recognized the context. This woman, Annie hasn't named her publicly, out of caution rather than protection, had apparently been part of the situation Nancy was navigating in her final months. Not as a villain, not as an enemy, but as someone who knew, someone who had been present at a crossroads in Nancy's life and had, for whatever reason, chosen not to speak. Annie reached out again. This time, she was more direct. She explained what she had found. She made clear she wasn't looking to assign blame. She was looking for understanding. The woman agreed to meet. That conversation, Annie says, lasted nearly 4 hours. It didn't give her the answers she had hoped for, but it gave her something arguably more valuable. Confirmation. Confirmation that her instincts, her reading of those fragmented notes, her sense that her mother had been living a kind of parallel reality in her final months, all of it was real. Nancy had not been imagining things. She had not been spiraling. She had been responding, rationally and with tremendous internal discipline, to circumstances that were genuinely difficult and genuinely dangerous. What those circumstances were exactly remains partly obscured. Annie has shared enough to make clear that the original investigation missed several threads she believes were significant, not because investigators were careless. She is careful to say that, but because they didn't have access to the information locked inside her mother's private notes or inside the memory of a woman who had chosen silence until Annie gave her a reason to speak. What Annie has revealed publicly centers less on the specific facts of what happened and more on the character of her mother's decision-making in those final weeks. Nancy, she says, was protecting someone, not herself, someone she loved, and that protective instinct, the same instinct that had made her a remarkable mother, a loyal friend, a constant presence in the lives of people who needed her, may have been exactly what led her to act alone, without a safety net, in a situation that desperately required one. This revelation lands differently depending on who you ask. For those who had assumed the worst about Nancy's disappearance, who accepted the darkest theories offered by true crime forums and speculative news coverage, it is a profound reorientation. For those who knew Nancy personally, it is painful confirmation of something they always suspected, that she would sacrifice her own safety before letting someone she loved bear the consequences of a situation she felt responsible for. And for Annie, it is both clarifying and devastating, because understanding her mother's reasoning doesn't make the absence smaller. If anything, it makes it larger, because now Annie can see exactly what was lost, exactly how much her mother gave, and exactly how alone Nancy must have felt in those final days, carrying everything and telling no one. Since coming forward with what she knows, Annie Guthrie's life has not become simpler. That's worth saying plainly. She did not speak because speaking was easy. She spoke because silence had become a weight she could no longer carry. Without it crushing her completely, the response has been complicated. There are people who have supported her, strangers who reached out to say that her mother's story resonates deeply, that it reflects something true about the invisible labor of women who protect everyone around them, while asking for nothing in return. Those messages, Annie has said, mean more to her than she can express. But there are also people who have pushed back, who have questioned her interpretation of her mother's notes, who have suggested, with varying degrees of cruelty, that Annie's grief is coloring her judgment, that she is constructing a narrative to avoid harder truths. Annie has heard all of it. She has read it, in some cases. She has sat with the profound discomfort of being publicly questioned about the most private, most devastating chapter of her life, and she has kept going, because the alternative, silence, retreat, waiting for someone else to carry this forward, is something she tried for years, and it didn't work. It didn't bring peace. It didn't bring answers. It brought only the particular loneliness of knowing things the world doesn't know and not being sure the world deserves to know them. That calculus shifted for Annie when she realized her mother's story was not just her family's story. It was a story about how women disappear, not just physically, but in all the smaller, quieter ways they vanish when they take on more than any one person should ever have to carry alone. The investigation into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance remains open. Annie is careful to acknowledge that. She does not know where her mother is. She does not know, with certainty, what happened after Nancy pulled out of that driveway on a Tuesday morning and waved at the neighbor who would become the last person to ever see her. What she knows is the woman. What she knows is the why, or at least the shape of it. And she has come to believe, painfully, slowly, through years of grief and research and conversation, that knowing the why is not a consolation prize. It is its own kind of truth. Incomplete, yes. Painful, absolutely. But real. Nancy Guthrie loved her family with the kind of love that asks nothing in return and gives without keeping score. She was flawed. Annie is clear about this, because honoring her mother means honoring all of her, not just the parts that make a clean and comfortable narrative. She made choices Annie doesn't fully understand, even now. She carried secrets her family is still uncovering, but she also showed up, day after day, in the small ways and the large ways, in the ways that never make the news and never get cataloged or counted. She showed up for the people she loved, and Annie believes, has to believe, that whatever happened in those final days, Nancy was doing the same thing she had always done, showing up for someone who needed her. Even when the cost was everything, there's a kind of grief that never resolves. It doesn't close like a wound. It opens differently over time, wider in some places, softer in others. occasionally startling you with a sharpness you thought had long since dulled.